Hey everyone, so this week I just want to give a really quick overview of some of the material you're going to encounter in Week 10 reading, Ethical and Legal Issue for Providers. Now, in Week 9, you will have gone through some more specific code of ethics for your particular field of practice, occupational therapy. But in this chapter, we're going to be talking about what looks like to be just for physicians, but we're going to challenge that a little bit because really a lot of these code of ethics and these obligations and legal issues for providers apply to an array of healthcare providers in the field. So let's get started. We open up this week's reading with Physicians' Code of Ethics, which really should be a code of ethics for all providers in healthcare. Things like compassion and respect for human dignity and rights, respecting the law, continual education, the importance of community health, and participating in public health initiatives, having the patient's best interest in mind, patient confidentiality, and professionalism. All of these are things that apply to really everybody who is a participant in providing healthcare to patients. So it doesn't just apply to physicians, even though this chapter is structured in such a way that it seems like it is really focusing on just physicians. Now, we've talked a lot up until this point, Week 10, about law, and we've talked about some ethics cases that have become case law situations that have changed the way the law is interpreted and applied. So there's obviously a relationship between ethics and law, but it's important to note, and you'll find this on page 292 of your chapter this week, that ethics goes beyond what the law covers, right? So just because something isn't necessarily illegal doesn't mean it's right. And I love this little quote here that's on page 292. The fact that a physician or any provider is acquitted or exonerated in a civil or criminal proceeding doesn't necessarily mean that the physician acted ethically. So a legal determination is not necessarily an ethical determination. There's obviously a relationship between ethics and law, but they are not dependent on one another. So it's a very tenuous line sometimes to walk when you're providing healthcare. And we say in clinical ethics, or for those of us who are ethicists, there's an important relationship to have with your hospital's legal services or attorneys, but we operate and function for very different purposes. And it's important to have that mutual function involved in healthcare. So we talk about a lot of different things in this chapter this week, but I want to go over just three briefly that I think are particularly relevant to the field of occupational therapy. The first one is patient privacy. There's a lot of different contexts in which occupational therapy happens, but it is by its own nature a fairly intimate process. Sometimes it happens in people's homes, sometimes in an outpatient setting, sometimes in the hospital. But you're doing things with patients' bodies, and oftentimes they're vulnerable, right? They're not doing something that they need to be able to do for everyday living. And so it is sort of a very intimate process when you're providing occupational therapy. So patient privacy is an important tenet here of ethics and professionalism in the obligations healthcare providers have. So information received by physicians in a confidential capacity relating to a patient's healthcare should not be disclosed without the patient's consent. That's true of any provider, not just physicians, right? So that applies to all healthcare providers. But I think that something that we see a lot in clinical ethics when we get ethics cases around patient privacy is that we often remember the conversational piece of patient privacy, like a patient told me something that was told to me in confidence. Obviously, this isn't a conversation about mandating reporting. That's totally separate and something that you have to do as a mandated reporter. But in terms of just conversation that you're having with patients, it's assumed that that's done in privacy. So you can basically assume anything that you're talking about with a patient is probably not something that you should then go on and whisper to your colleague during lunch break, right? It's a confidential situation. But what we forget sometimes is how that information can be documented and how it is we're documenting the engagement or encounter we're having with patients. So think about not just the conversation piece or the discourse that you're having with patients verbally, but also when you're documenting, think about where's this information going to be documented and who else can see it. And that has had some pretty dramatic implications here as of late with some new legislation where MyChart is a feature in a lot of medical records now where patients can very easily access their medical records both inside and outside the hospital. And we forget that a lot of what we write is just at the fingertips of patients and their loved ones. So we've had a lot of situations in which patients have provided MyChart access or their medical record access to a variety of different people who they trust or who are somehow getting access to their records. And that has caused some ethical dilemmas and caused some challenges. So I always advise practitioners, right? Don't just think about what you're verbally talking about with your patients. Also think about what you're documenting and who's going to see that or has access to it. I think we used to think at a given point in time that medical records were sealed or like sealed files, but that's very much not the case anymore. And it's something new in healthcare that we have to be aware of. So patient privacy is a big one to consider. And then patient treatment, right? So this week we talk about a lot of different kinds of treatment, and there are a lot of different kinds of occupational therapy, right? A lot of different fields in which you can practice occupational therapy, which have a lot to do with the different kinds of treatments that are available, the different purposes of why we're offering this kind of treatment. And so I think that it's always important to make sure you're having a conversation with patients from the beginning of what are their expectations about this treatment, what do they expect this treatment is going to accomplish, and then talk with them as the expert in providing that treatment, whether those expectations they have are reasonable and attainable. If they are, great. Set up a plan, think about how many sessions you think tentatively they will need to be able to accomplish their expectations. And if their expectations aren't realistic, make sure you have that conversation from the beginning and maybe set different goals. So we often have ethical dilemmas and some ethical challenges when there's a disconnect between what the patient's expecting the treatment to accomplish and what the provider actually knows that treatment can or cannot accomplish, especially when there's limits to treatment, which really every treatment intervention in healthcare has its limitations. So you want to make sure that you're providing treatment that's appropriate, that's indicated for the situation and for the kind of treatment that they need, but also making sure that the expectations of what the patient thinks this treatment is going to accomplish ends up being something that's feasible and something that, in your expertise, is possible to accomplish. A lot of lawsuits happen when there's a disconnect there. The patient thinks, this is what I thought that treatment was going to do, and actually, that treatment couldn't do that. So, thirdly, we're looking at discharge and follow up. And there's a lot of responsibility that falls on providers when it comes to discharge. We have an obligation to make sure that patients are, first of all, ready for discharge, medically ready for discharge, and being discharged to a safe environment. So, those are some ethical qualms that can come up during discharge disposition scenarios where we're trying to figure out where is the safest place for this patient to go. But discharge instructions, like this week's reading talks about, needs to be clear, it needs to be complete, and they need to be ready for discharge, but also connected with the appropriate necessary resources to make that discharge safe and to make sure that if they need to have some kind of continual follow-up with some kind of healthcare or medical field or specialty, that they're being set up with those referrals. And when I think of occupational therapy, of course, some of that happens in an inpatient setting or very connected to an acute setting. but a lot of it happens in an outpatient setting or part of a discharge plan. So there's a lot of occupational therapy happening within the context of post-acute care. So I always feel like in healthcare, there's such a disconnect between that acute setting and then all of the healthcare being provided outside of acute care settings. So I always advise that these providers need to talk to each other. If you're getting a patient that's come from an acute care setting, look through the notes and talk to the provider who gave you the referral. See if you can find out a little bit of background of what's important for this patient's needs, sort of how did they end up with this injury, and just be informed of making that relationship not only with the provider that cared for them in an acute care setting, but also to be able to do that sort of continuity of care between acute care settings and that discharge follow-up process that often lands in the lap of follow-up care, such as occupational therapy. We really want to be able to enhance a patient's experience with healthcare because who knows what their experience was like in an acute care setting. It's a very different environment. There's a lot of people coming in and out of your room, and it can be hectic. I love the settings of outpatient because it's so much more personable. There is a little bit more time to have conversation and a little bit more time to create or maintain that relationship with the patient that they need to be able to get and trust those that are providing them healthcare and um, medical services. So this week, we're going to be doing an ethics case study, your second ethics case study. So when you're looking at that case study, think about what parts of the cases, if any, are ethical obligations that the providers actually have. And see if you can, based on this week's reading, spell those out and say, these are obligations that the physician had, these are obligations that, in general, the healthcare team had, and see if you can be able to spell out what those obligations are in the ethics case if it applies. Happy reading.